we think we're going to turn the AI into our servants and robots and pets, getting well paid now or taking care of the machines.
I was waking up this morning, waking up before it's getting night.
When I think about the atomic bomb, and you kind of wrote a chapter about it, and especially for Japanese, it's a very shocking.
That's very hard to do, and the people who created the atomic bomb.
はい、こんにちは。ピボットの竹下です。世界的なアメリカの科学史家、ジョージ・ダイソンさんのインタビューの後編をお届けします。前編はですね、なんと驚くべきことに、ダイソンさんは今後アナログが重視される時代が来ると言ってました。最近だとこのアナロジアという本を書いてるんですが、本当に今のテクノロジー全盛時代からより混乱した、よりノイズがある、より幅広くて豊かなアナログの時代が来るということを言ってるんですね。そんな話をしました。で、後編ではですね、本当にそのアナログの時代っていうのは魅力的なことなのかっていうことを、原爆の歴史、テクノロジーの負の面も聞きながら話したりとか、あと教育の面も話して深掘りをしていきたいと思います。後編もですね、本当に刺激的インタビューで、最後にはこのジョージ・ダイソンさんの未来の予言みたいなのも聞いてみたいと思いますので、後編のインタビューをお届けしたいと思います。It's interesting because in Japan there's a term called analog 人間 which literally means analog human beings, and it's like a negative phrase for like old generation who can't use iPad or iPhones. Yeah, so analog is a bad term in Japan. So I was surprised that, you're using analog as a very positive, very creative word. But I know what you mean. Yeah, it's digital on top, digital analog combined, or is it analog on top of digital? Yeah,
it's layers. It's an analog layer, the same way we have a digital layer on top of the analog world, and now I think we're growing a new analog layer on top of, and it's the way nature tends to work, is to sort of adapt old systems to, the feathers of birds were originally scales of dinosaurs or something.
Okay, so I want to go back to the 4 epochs of nature for just a review for our viewers. Number 1 was hand tools. Number 2 was machines, and number 3, machines making copies of themselves. And we're in a transition from epoch 3 to number 4. And in 4, machines are taking side of nature, and nature is taking side of machines. And that kind of world, we have wild AIs. And the interesting part in your book is about your daughter texting you, and there was an infant having mother's milk but playing with iPad. Yeah,
that was 2012. So that's almost 12 years ago. Yeah, my daughter got a job in San Francisco and texted me. She rarely communicates. She was at that stage where she didn't want to talk to dad, but she sent me a text saying, I've landed in San Francisco and there's a baby in the airport. So young, it was still nursing, drinking mother's milk, playing on an iPad. And so everyone looks at that from one way to look at that is, well, the baby is playing with the iPad. They think, whoa, there's all these interesting images, and because babies are so visual. And the iPad, I don't know what it had on it, but it probably had pictures. But the other way to look at it is on the other side of the screen is the networked digital intelligence. It doesn't even need to be digital, but I sort of view the whole thing as an AI. So there's this other entity on the other side, and it's looking out and saying, "Wow, a baby. This is really interesting. This is somebody who speaks my language more than the grown-ups. The grown-ups aren't really listening, but this baby is going to get it." And I think that's very much what's going to happen. There's another, of course, fantastic science fiction story, Childhood's End, by Arthur Clarke, published in 1953. But there, the aliens come down, and the way they sort of take over, just suddenly all the children are speaking a different language that the grown-ups don't understand.
Yeah, so maybe the iPad or the dolphins might think that children are the ones who understand about us.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's very, in the bad Hollywood movies, the aliens land, they want to talk to the president of the United States.
Right.
Actually, they want to talk to some kid.
So are you saying that it was not the baby playing with the iPad, but also the iPad playing with the baby?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's my.
That's interesting. I'm little bit worried that if such thing happens, maybe, it's like a Richard Dawkins story that we are kind of vehicles of AI or robots. Is that the case, or are we going to get along with AI?
It's very possible. It's possible. It's quite possible again, because we think we're going to turn the AI into our servants and robots and pets, and it could completely be the other way, that we get turned into which in a way is sort of what's happened already. I mean, if most of the people getting well paid now are taking care of the machines. It's just the way it is.
Are you positive about such future?
I'm mixed. I mean, you want to be optimistic, but you also want to be realistic. So I would say I'm a little bit on the pessimistic side. But I think when I originally wrote that book, it had an opening chapter and an ending chapter that were both fiction. And in the opening chapter was before the Russians arrived. So you had this culture that had been going on for 10,000 years with no written language. And I wanted to give a picture of what that would be like. And then at the end chapter was back in the Aleutians again, where the world had become completely, like you were talking about, complete digital bureaucracy. But in its wisdom, the human species had decided to leave certain wild reserves, and one of them being the Aleutian Islands, where people could live in the wild as long as they had no digital technology. So it was sort of back to the way it was 10,000 years ago. But then I gave up. I just can't write fiction. I'm not that kind of writer.
That's an interesting point. Are you going to plan to write fiction in the future?
No, I don't think so. It's just so hard to do. It's too late for me.
Are you planning any other books in the future, nonfiction?
No, actually, that's one reason why I think one of your, the question is, why is there so much in this book? Because I really felt this is my last book. I'm saying what I think is important to say, and sort of every day now I wake up happy that I'm not writing another book, and I can kind of think with a clear mind about whatever I want to think about. All my books have taken sort of 10 years each. It's been these huge efforts. I don't do it easily.
So I also read Turing's Cathedral. So this is a Japanese version. So do you think the two books are connected, or yeah?
Yes. I mean, Turing's Cathedral is very strictly or reasonably clearly the story of how the digital universe sort of happened, how it's like the creation myth for how the myth about the machines, people who created the machines on the digital side. And now I wanted to tell that's the story of how that's not everything. There's an analog world that's just as important. So it's sort of the other side of the story.
And by reading your Turing's Cathedral, I believe that Turing and Van Neumann understand that stuff. So they were not trying to make like a human brain, but they were trying to make something different.
Yes, they knew it was completely different. The tragedy is von Neumann wrote a book that was published after he died as The Computer and the Brain, and people just didn't read the book. They just read the title and thought, von Neumann believes the brain is a computer, and the whole book was actually about why the brain is completely different from a computer, and how if we want to do really interesting computation, it's going to have to be more like the brain, and that kind of got lost.
Do you think we're beginning to realize that the computer and the brain is different, or are we in still the mixed image that the both are the same?
No, we're realizing. I mean, the interesting thing is that if you talk to biologists and neurologists, of course, they all know this. They take it for granted. It's only the computer people who think that and even they are sort of waking up now, and it's understood that. And of course, all this sort of ChatGPT kind of stuff, the deep learning is being done with simulated artificial neural networks that are sort of simulations of what goes on in a nervous system, but they're still simulated using digital computers and digital code. But we're very clearly moving the way we did in the 1940s, where we were building digital computers out of analog hardware. Now we're using these digital chips, but there's going to be immense market pressure now to actually put like these language models, these maps, to actually put them on analog chips rather than digital chips, and then they will run for like 1/100th the power consumption, be much cheaper and faster. And the companies that do that, there's a number of big companies doing small projects and small companies doing big projects, but that's going to take over the world. It's like at the back, whenever it was when we had the first 4-bit chip that was in a calculator, and then suddenly people realized, oh, you can do all these other things with it.
Yeah, so in the future, I believe there will be more robots than human beings. So when you look at history, we have encountered a lot of indigenous people, and I think the key is to how to get along with people with different cultures. What can we learn from history? How can we get along with robots and AI?
Yeah, we need to just obviously treat people better. Done a very bad job of that. And with robots, it's the same thing. I mean, we need to not treat them as our slaves. And I'm not saying that in some sort of anthropomorphic way, but just don't take them for granted and think that it's going to be a new relationship, and it should be different.
But one thing I'm afraid about technology is when I think about the atomic bomb, and you kind of wrote a chapter about it, and especially for Japanese, it's a very shocking chapter. So, I agree that robots will be around, we can get along with them, and there'll be wild AIs, and there'll be nature-like machines. But on the other hand, I'm afraid that it will be out of control. So how can we prevent from us making another atomic bomb and starting a genocide?
That's very hard to do. And the people who created the atomic bomb, most of them, or many of them, and of course, particularly some of the people I talked to a lot, spent the rest of their lives trying to exactly that, trying to keep this from doing more harm than it had. And we're in a very difficult situation. It's interesting that my father, who died 3 years ago, but he was always, one of the things he was worried about most before the Soviet Union collapsed, and when most people were worrying about a nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union, he was worried more about a Soviet civil war between Ukraine and the other faction in the Soviet Union. And that's very much I think the fear we should have now, that at the time the Soviet Union split up, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear power in the world and gave up its nuclear weapons, but there's still there's still a very real threat that the Russia we have now is a very unstable place and still has all those weapons, and there's sort of crazy people who could use them. I'm not saying civil war in Russia, but it's just as dangerous as the sort of their use between the powers themselves. The same way this is true in the United States too. That I think we have hopefully slightly better safety systems in place to keep. But submarines are particularly bad. That by definition, sort of the reason submarines are such a good deterrent is because the people out in a submarine have the authority to, they can retaliate even without, with all communications destroyed. And that's a very, very dangerous thing. And it's just, it's absolutely crazy that we have not solved a nuclear weapon. I mean, nuclear weapons are a much bigger threat than, personally, I think, than anything else. One of the problems is we've stopped testing. So, like, one of my books was about, the whole book was about using nuclear weapons in space, and I interviewed lots of people who were deeply involved in nuclear weapons policy and so on. And they all would start out by telling me, let me tell you about the time I saw a test. After seeing that test, I knew we have to never use these ones. These are the tests of the hydrogen bombs that are 1,000 times the scale of the bombs dropped on Japan. But those people had seen those tests in the atmosphere, and we don't do that anymore, which is good. But it means we now have people making decisions who've never actually seen the power of these weapons.
Yeah, you did a great job illustrating the complexity of the issue, because a lot of the scientists, they were not just simple bad people who want to make a weapon of mass destruction, but there were a lot of motivation in it. Maybe someone wanted the money, or maybe they want the finance to do their research, or they just wanted to prove they were right. So that's the difficult part of science, that there's so many incentives and motivation when human beings come together. So yeah, it's a difficult question, how to keep control of such, not going to such a disaster.
Yes, and it's exactly, you're absolutely right to make the analogy between AI and nuclear weapons, because it's the same issue. So people end up doing this for very personal reasons. They do things that, now we're going to have a big film about Oppenheimer, who had his own motivations,
Right.
Personal, that I don't know if the film is going to touch on, but they're really, some of these motivations that motivate things that change history actually come from very deep personal feelings.
So also you spend a lot of time with building kayak and studying about Native Americans and indigenous people. What can we learn from them, that they seem to take good control of technology and nature and keep a good balance? What can we learn from them?
Yes, just that it's, humans have such a long history, and what's almost incomprehensible, that the people who lived in the Aleutian Islands lived there continuously we know for a fact that there's settlements where they lived for 9,800 years, and we keep sort of pushing that clock back, and that's sort of a continuous culture without things changing. We're sort of so addicted to things have to change from one generation to the next, and the world can operate quite well if they don't. Much more stable state.
I heard you lived in a tree house that's about 95 feet above. It's about 30 meters above. Yeah, could you share us your experience?
Yeah, just as a teenager, 19 years old, I now if you tell people if you say you lived in a treehouse for 3 years, the assumption is you were trying to save the rainforest, or I just needed a place to live, and I'd done a lot of climbing at that time, so I just built this house 30 meters up in a tree, and it spent 3 years there that were still sort of the focus of my life. I think about those years. I mean, I wouldn't do it again, but it was absolutely wonderful, and gave me this deep sense of, sort of trees as living organisms, and all the stuff that now is actually being scientifically studied, how trees have networks of communication through the forest, but living in one, it was absolutely clear that something was going on. And the other interesting thing is how different life is just 30 meters up on the ground. This is rainforest. On the ground, it's all dark and damp and wet, but in the forest canopy is a very different climate, different. It was absolutely wonderful.
Do you want to go back to the treehouse?
No, but I go back to it in my mind all the time. No computer, no electricity, no telephone, just a different world. I just read books.
So by reading your book, I kind of thinking about education, because right now in the modern age, we're too much focusing on, not hands-on knowledge. So do you think, from your experience, like building a kayak or living in a treehouse, we should focus more on like hands-on knowledge, like directly experiencing nature? We should put that part much more into education system.
Yes, I think it's really important. I mean, you can learn a lot of the other stuff from books and so on, but there's, I learned so much just from people I met when I started traveling up the coast alone, and I would meet people who would teach me things. And in a strange way, we're doing that now with YouTube, which I never use, and I don't have any, I don't make YouTube videos, but if you want to find out how to fix a carburetor on a 1956 American car, which was exactly the kind of knowledge that used to get passed sort of hand to hand from one person to their child or whatever. Now you actually, you think, oh, that knowledge is gone, but actually there's somebody on YouTube who will tell you very clearly how to fix a carburetor. And that's true even of lots of wilderness skills and things like that in a strange way that people have this drive to learn these very obscure skills and then teach them to other people. So I think stuff will survive.
It's an interesting point. Does that mean that we're shifting from like a digital world to more analog, more complex world because people are watching YouTube?
No, I mean I don't, it's a very self-selection thing that if I look for a YouTube video, it's exactly that. It's some car problem or something I can't figure out. But of course, there's people looking at all sorts of other stuff. But it is very much a person-to-person medium.
Yes.
You wonder, like, why did that guy make that video? I mean, there's only 12 people in the world who are going to be interested in fixing that carburetor, but it's human nature to want to pass on your knowledge.
Because I started my career as a journalist, writing articles on text, but I'm doing a lot of videos right now, and I feel I can send more information to an audience using video because it feels more hands-on, more human nature-like knowledge. So I really agree to your point. Yeah. So there's also an interesting quote in your book that when people followed Leibniz's mission and they headed to Alaska and people started dying, that they realized that rank learning and knowledge would not be an advantage, but they began to regard many things as treasures, such as needles or knives or those things. Do you think we are also beginning to realize that such unwritten knowledge is important these days?
Yes, and that's always what happens in the science fiction story, which is, and it's what happens in many of the books I love. Some catastrophe happens, and then suddenly, the people who know how to fix carburetors suddenly save the world because it's that knowledge. And I think that's but you can completely imagine. It's not hard to imagine some scenario where the internet just breaks down. I mean, it either it's sabotage or cyber warfare or something, but it really grinds to a halt, and then you can't, you won't be able to, because now if there's any kind of problem, you Google how to solve the problem, and then suddenly the people who actually know how to solve problems, or it's like in times of natural disaster, it's the amateur radio operators who set up communication links and so on. So those people save us in the end, and I think that may well happen. We don't know.
Yeah, I agree, because here in Japan, catastrophe means earthquakes, and when I interview the survivors, they 100% say that those who are the heroes are not using their iPhones, but people who can fix the cars or cook food or do those simple things. Is that why? Because this is a very unique book. Instead of like talking only about computers, you start the history with Leibniz and all the adventures. Is that the reason you put a lot of stories about nature in your book for us, the readers, to understand what real knowledge is?
Yes, and the whole point of the book was that Leibniz had these two great projects. He tried to convince Peter the Great to one of them was to launch an expedition to America, and the other one he wanted to do what we did 300 years later, to create a sort of digitally governed society using binary codes, and that Peter the Great had no interest in that. But to me, those were sort of the two things that occupied my life, were the sort of history of the Russians on the Northwest coast, and then the history of digital computing. And when I realized that both those grand programs can be traced back to Leibniz, I knew that was where I would start the story. So it begins in the hot springs, where Leibniz is trying to explain this just before he dies to Peter the Great.
So what was Leibniz thinking? Because it seems that those two things maybe contradict each other. It's kind of an opposite. Or do you think that's the same in a certain layer?
Well, when you write a story, you're free to. It's like writing a novel. You can kind of choose your characters. So Leibniz did all sorts of other stuff and mathematics and things that I ignored. I just focused on these two projects. But it happened he was trying to sort of push them at the same time. It didn't get anywhere on the digital side.
So before we wrap up, I know you're a historian, but I hate to say the predictions, but could you give us some predictions what would happen in the future in the computer world and the digital world?
No, yeah, it's very hard to make, and
Yes.
I'm not a futurist at all. I'm more interested in the past, because if you want to, if you're walking in the wilderness and you don't want to get lost, you need to look at where you've come from. It gives you a sense of where you're going. But clearly my prediction is that analog computing is going to become important again. I don't know how long it will take for that to be recognized, but so I predict, okay, you can here's a firm sort of, predictions are no good if they're not sort of quantifiable and checkable. But if you go to a major computer science department in a university now, you will find almost no classes on analog computing. All the classes will be digital computing. And I predict that in 20 years, or maybe it'll take 50 years or 10 years at best, but you go to a computer science department and they actually will be teaching analog computing again.
Interesting. How about the big tech companies? Do they understand that shift?
Some of them do. I mean, like Intel had a whole division building analog chips, and I think it got, I don't know what happened. It was running great for a few years, and then I think it may have been canceled. But they had an annual conference. It was fascinating, where they were giving these chips to graduate students to do interesting things with, and interesting stuff was being done. And I assume they're going to get back into this. And I know NVIDIA, who do the graphic processing units, they must be thinking about this, because it's been it was interesting how the sort of Bitcoin craze was a big driver of building more powerful, adapting these graphic processing units for a different thing. That's what's going to happen with these the current sort of deep learning stuff is going to drive building much better neural network models that ultimately they will be more than models. They will actually be neural networks again. And that will change everything.
So just to clarify for our viewers, when you say analog computing, it's not a computer made of wood, but you can make analog computers out of silicon. It's not yeah. Mm-hmm.
The most interesting analog computing conference I went to was at Sandia. That's the lab that makes, Los Alamos designs the nuclear weapons, but the nuclear weapons are actually built at a nearby lab called Sandia. And they have their own silicon chip fab, because every American nuclear weapon has chips in it, but you can't use a store-bought chip in a nuclear weapon. It's just not the way it's done. So they have a complete sort of Intel level chip fab there, but it only needs to make 10,000 chips once every few years when they update our nuclear weapon stuff. On the rest of the time, it's sort of idle. It's actually not good. It's like leaving a car. It's better to drive a car than just leave it sitting. So they had a very small program there with just a few people thinking of interesting things they could do with this chip fab while it was idle. And one of the things they started doing was building analog chips, because you can make completely analog non-digital chips using the existing silicon technology of masks and layers and photolithography, and they were doing amazing, interesting things. And I think that's the drivers are cell phones, drones, and self-driving cars are the things that will really push this forward.
Got it. That's why you mentioned it's a kind of a layer, not going back to analog, but it's kind of a layer.
Yeah. And again, there'll be another prediction that if you take apart a cell phone in 20 years, it will have real analog chips in it. They won't be doing everything, but for language recognition, things like that will actually be hardwired as an analog network, not a digital.
And there'll be a lot more wild AIs around us.
Yes. Yeah. And it will, when we do build those analog chips, it will suddenly, everything will take the same leap that it took from vacuum tubes to integrated circuits. It's just going to be so much more power and so much more computing power with so much less energy consumption.
And we as human beings should get used to that. There's a lot of things we cannot control.
Yes. That's my personal view. I'm on the side of nature.
Okay, so could you give some final comments for our Japanese viewers who are about to read your book or are reading your book right now?
Yes, you don't need to read it in order, and you don't need to read if you're interested in the Russians in Alaska, read that chapter, and if you're interested in computing, there's some at the beginning and the end, and it's a mix of things, sort of like a book of stories, where every chapter tries to tell a story, but you don't have to follow it step by step, and it's short. It's sort of half the length of my previous book.
Right. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, George Dyson. I really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Very, very good questions, and it's wonderful to speak with you.
So my favorite book in those days was a fellow named Mainu.
著者の思いや日本語にまだ翻訳されていない生のグローバル情報をお届けします。
Japanese work culture in the companies where people are stuck.
I believe the only logical approach.
Any advice for Japanese investors?
So I cannot say too many times, stay with what you know, and that's how you'll be successful. Everybody knows something about something. Stay with it. Now, some people will say, oh, Jim, that's boring. Ryan, be boring. If you want to be a successful investor, be boring.